Okay, I think it's time for us to get started. So thank you everyone for joining to this particular session, breakout session as part of the Smarter SOC Summit. This session is focusing on how to continuously identify threat detection gaps and optimize response actions. So today I'm joined by Bruce Roton, VP and Global Head of Security Strategy here at CyberProof. My name is Ben Chant, Global Product Marketing Lead for CyberProof. Bruce, you want to give a quick intro to yourself, a bit of background?
All right. I've been in the IT business for about 44 years. Started out as a programmer, moved into networking, and spent the last 20 years dedicated to security. And I'm also a former hacker, so I tend to look at things slightly different perspective than a lot of people.
So I think we're in a great position to start this particular subject. And just a reminder for everyone that if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask them at any time by using the chat function, and we'll gladly answer them. So as part of this session, just want to go through quickly the agenda. So we'll start by covering the relevance of detection and response in terms of strategic security goals and the level of importance that it's now at. Particularly in this era, especially in the pandemic era. We'll look into the questions that you should be asking, both bottom up in terms of to the board, but also top down from the board to SOC operations down to the technical level and to engineers, etc. And then we'll look at the complexity of detection and response and what it actually means in terms of putting in place a detection and response process and all the elements as part of that. And the next section will cover how to continuously improve detection and response, covering things from, and we'll give a definition as well in terms of what a use case kit is and the approach that we're taking with the use case kit. And then we'll go through that approach in more detail and how we use what we call a use case factory to develop use case kits. So with that, I will start us off with the first section, the relevance detection and response to strategic goals. Now, I think this is it's a really important message to outline here, because as we know, the importance of cybersecurity to business and the inevitability of cyber incidents has meant that we're now at a point where the ability to be able to detect and respond to threats is directly impacting strategic goals. And I want to just go into that a little bit. So how does it do that? Well, if you look across those three core business goals, they're also security goals. And when you look at reducing costs, for example, you need to ask yourself, do you know how much you've actually been spending on cybersecurity? But do you also know what you're getting back from that expenditure in terms of has that given you effective ROI? Over the last decade, we've seen a strong momentum towards buying more solutions, and that's partly because our understanding of cyber risk has been based on security technology spending spree, promising that those technologies or vendors will be able to protect us, and then having a kind of thin monitoring layer for compliance reasons or for as part of the SOC to meet regulatory compliance. And what's the result of that? Well, enterprises spend too much money, time and effort firefighting some of those issues, meeting regulatory requirements, taking a checkbox approach, installing prevention tools, and this is partly the problem. I think at the moment is that where security was thought of as prevention first, we now need to turn that dial into being able to detect and respond to threats, because essentially being able to, in order to be able to prevent attacks from happening, you need to first be able to detect them, and then put in place a prevention control. And this is where we're really trying to swing the dial with the customers as well. And due to all this noise being created from multiple point solutions, and the perimeter now expanding to mobile, cloud, IoT, we're now needing to focus our efforts even more on detection and response, and try and filter through that noise. In terms of measuring business risk as a goal for the business, and it's a goal for security as well. Boards generally are very well versed in assessing financial risk, or regulatory risk, but not so well with assessing cyber risk. And it's generally not that well understood with boards. It's getting better, but traditionally has been behind the ability to assess financial risk, for example. And that has been one of the reasons why, let alone trying to demonstrate the performance of the SOC operation. That's why communication has traditionally been quite poor, and there's been some barriers to communication to be able to demonstrate return on investment, progression of security programs, etc. But when we talk about detection and response, if the operation teams are talking about using tools such as MITRE ATT&CK, using some frameworks like NIST or ISO 27001 to try and ensure that they're using best practices for detection and response, they're great ways of being able to quantify gaps in security, but it's a security framework. It's not a risk matrix or a risk framework. So therein lies the gap. So we therefore have to integrate or align business risk with risk management principles that need to then be integrated into detection and response processes. So what do I mean by that? Well, understanding the loss events that the business wants to avoid, and putting in place an agile methodology to be able to focus the security operations center and detecting the attack scenarios that will bring those loss events or negative outcomes into fruition. And it's important to note that when we talk about risk management, and what does that mean for the SOC? Yes, risk measurement is a way of what we mean by risk management is to kind of quantify risk in terms of value at risk, but it's also meant to be driving the right behavior. So how do we do that with the SOC, for example? And then finally, increasing efficiency. When we talk about efficiency for the SOC, we often talk about using automation, enrichment to help respond quicker, detect and respond quicker, and using tools such as digital playbooks to be able to help teams to respond quicker, but also more specifically in areas where an analyst typically spends a lot of time, such as triaging, response, enrichment, etc. But the attack surface is evolving rapidly and continuously. So just automating steps isn't going to solve the problem. You need to know exactly what the right steps are. Otherwise, you're just going to be automating bad behaviors. And what we've seen is certainly that the industry has a history of applying quite an infrastructure-like, and I know Bruce is going to go into this a bit more as well, an infrastructure-like approach or mindset, as it were, in terms of security. So putting in a box, putting in this a security control, antivirus, firewalls, etc., and then trying to report back on the effectiveness of those controls. But actually, we need to be thinking more like software developers. And if you were in one of the previous sessions, Tony also used this analogy, that we need to think like software developers in the sense that what are the use cases that we need to build security controls for, and therefore what are the top risks I need to avoid, and how can we ensure that detection and response is helping us to mitigate those scenarios which will cause those loss events, those negative outcomes to happen. And we need to have an agile way of doing that, because the process that goes into that, and again Bruce will go into this in more detail, the process that goes into that is very robust, and it takes a lot of manpower. There's a lot of different modular components that are part of it, such as detection rules, automation, integration of technologies, and you need to constantly stay ahead of that. So I'm going to pass over to Bruce now to just go into these a bit more detail and to bring some more context to it.
All right. So I really think of this as trying to answer the question, why is security such a hard problem? And having been in the business for over 20 years, I've seen the evolution of it from the early 2000s where we had a firewall, IDS, IPS, antivirus, you were good to go. And now there are literally dozens of point solutions that have been implemented, and every vendor is saying, if you implement my solution, buy my solution, it'll protect you from all of your problems. And we've ended up in an environment where we have literally dozens of different point solutions, as well as a much more complex IT infrastructure. And the cost of labor has gone up significantly, and even finding people that have these skill sets is a challenge. A good ArcSight engineer can cost $180,000 a year, and hiring one and that job search can easily take 6 to 8 months. So it's a problem of complexity. So one of the things I recognize is that even with all the money that we spend on these point solutions, security professionals really struggle to answer seven very fundamental questions to executive management, and that is, what are we getting, or how much are we reducing our risk based on the money we've spent? Did we do the right things? Are we being effective? Did we protect the right things? Are we focused on the things that matter most? Have we mapped the spend to actual business risk? Are we spending too much, not enough? How do we rationalize that equipment? Does it overlap? Are we buying 5 things that essentially do the same job? Did we spend enough money, not enough money? How do these things work together? And the way these parts interact is by nature fairly complex. Do the systems work together to increase our protection? Do they overlap in function? How do we measure success? How would we know if we're being successful? And are we improving as an organization? And how do we prove that? How do we show that month over month, quarter over quarter, year over year, we're getting better at it? So I have a few suggestions there, and they revolve around 4 basic ideas. One is stop the market inertia. There's a strong momentum towards simply buying more solutions. And I say, slow down for a bit and consider what you're actually trying to accomplish and how those pieces are going to fit together. 2, there's a general lack of a holistic approach and methodology. So invest in a comprehensive and future-focused methodology to solve the problem. And since the problem is very complex, break it down into manageable functions and deploy the right project tools so you can manage it. And last but not least, as Ben said earlier, align to the business risk. Integrate risk management practices into security management. Typically, I look at organizations, and those are 2 departments that rarely, if ever, talk to each other. And you look at the risk register, and there's no real linkage between the risk register and things going on in security management. And you can see here that there's layers of complexity, taking all the inputs and then validating those against the business risk, and then building the components to do the detection, develop a response that's adequate, possibly automate some of that response to ensure that it fits within a response window. We'll talk about what that means a little bit later, and then operationalizing it so that you can deploy methodologies quickly and reliably. So I'm going to pick on just one section here and show you what I mean in terms of the complexity. You look at attack scenarios, and a lot of people would say, well, I've got an attack scenario and I can defend against it with XYZ device. But at the end of the day, you've got to break that down into the taxonomy of that attack scenario, all of the tactics and techniques that are being used in it, and also the not just the taxonomy, but the ontology and the relationship between them. Now, let's take an example of an attack where, let's say, one of the critical elements of that attack is lateral movement. And you might say, this is great, lateral movement, that's pretty simple. There's only 9 different techniques. But then when you expand out the sub-techniques, you see that there's 18 different techniques that someone could use to do that one tactic within that attack. And there may be 2, 3, 5 different ways that you could detect that technique depending on where you were detecting it and the tools you had in your environment. So you can see that the attacker has the advantage of being able to use those techniques like Lego building blocks and build an attack scenario that you may not have thought of before. So this makes the defense extremely complex in assembling that ontology.
Yeah, and just to cut in, I'll just also let people know that we'll be posting the link. I think we already have posted the link on the chat here to the SANS reports, which CyberProof sponsored, measuring and improving cyber defense using the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So Bruce spoke a little bit about the MITRE ATT&CK. We will go into it a bit later as well, but just for your reference as well, please go to chat and check out the link. That may answer some of your questions. Sorry, Bruce, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, one of the other things we need to do when we're mapping out this ontology is construct a map that includes all of the potential techniques and then start to predict, if I see these 4 techniques, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, if I see these 4 techniques, I'm likely in this particular scenario, which means that these other 6 techniques are things that I should be looking for. So you can start looking for them. In other words, detect what you can, predict what's coming next, detect that, validate which scenario you're in, and then start working on the response and prevention.
Yeah, and actually, I've had the privilege of working closely with Bruce in terms of trying to, well, what we'll come to later is our use case factory and how that works. But when we look at developing detection and response with our customers, I've had the pleasure to kind of to see firsthand the complexities that go into this, and hear some of the complexities that customers are facing when trying to optimize their detection and response processes. And some of them may say, I just need to make sure I map it to the MITRE ATT&CK, and I can, and we kind of say to them, well, how do you do that? And there's clearly a lot of modular components that go into this, and you look at this as a potential kind of process, and it clearly needs the resources and the skills to be able to do that. And especially now during the pandemic, when there's stringent budgets in place, how easy do you think it is, Bruce, for organizations to be able to find the resources and skills to be able to put this kind of process in place?
For the large organizations, there's usually 2 or 3 people that have this level of skill. Yeah. For mid-sized organizations, there may be 1 or no people in the organization that really have the right skill set. Yeah. And it may require some additional tooling and training. But one of the nice things about being able to outsource is being able to tap into a broader pool of resources, yeah, that have that expertise and allow them to embrace the complexity of the environment in ways that the organization doesn't necessarily need to. And I'll give you an example. I worked on many years ago on the F-16 development, and I look at the organizations as the pilots. They had to know how to fly it. But the bottom line was, without the onboard computer and avionics and flight control systems, if those went out, they couldn't fly it. It was a flying brick. So the bottom line is, it was an incredibly complex machine, but they didn't need to know all of that. What they needed to know was how to tell the system what they wanted to do, and then have the system respond to it appropriately. And when I developed the real-time system for the flight avionics, the pilots didn't need to know the complexity behind how that system was working. All they needed to know is how to operate the controls.
Yeah, and with that, I think, you know, let's have a look at a little bit more around exactly what organizations should be doing. You know, I think you know, the process and the steps that you take differ for every organization, of course. There's not a one way that you should be doing this, but there's certainly some commonalities in how you should be approaching this. And one of them is, and one way of doing this is kind of leveraging what we call use case kits. And the idea of this is to be able to continuously improve your detection and response in a way that's effective, ensuring that you'll be able to you know, defend yourselves against the right type of attack scenarios and techniques, efficient, doing it in a way that's fast, and speeding up detection and response, and making sure you're responding in that target response window for acceptable loss, but also ensuring that you're continuously delivering value as time goes on. And really, in order to kind of understand these steps that we're outlining here, we need to be on a level playing field in terms of what a use case kit actually is. So here is our attempt at that, and this is something we tend to go through with clients as well. A use case kit is a complete detection and response package. A lot of people view use cases as a detection scenario, cybersecurity threats in SIM, platform, etc., or certain IDS, IPS controls, EDRs. But the reality is that it does include a lot more. So use case is really a specific attacker technique, but this is kind of our attempt to try and boil this down into what we call a use case kit, consisting of that, as I said, detection and response package. It also consists of other components to enable this to actually happen efficiently, such as integrations and automations designed to rapidly identify and mitigate a cyber attack, as well as being able to making sure that you don't exceed that level of acceptable risk. And it definitely relies on modularity of design for both rapid development and deployment. And what do we mean by continuous improvement? Well, what we mean is, and this is something again we go through with customers, is we typically start with suggesting, sorry, not suggesting, but more kind of starting by identifying the negative outcomes, what we call negative outcomes, or business risks, or loss events, however you want to call it. That could, and that, you know, that's looking at in terms of in relation to cybersecurity, so a digital asset or cyber-related loss event. And these are the highest level abstractions of risk. Each outcome may have varying degrees of an impact. It just depends on what that negative outcome is, and Bruce will go into that in more detail. But examples can be fraud, disruption, data exfiltration, etc. And then you need to then look at all the ways or scenarios that are mapped to those negative outcomes or loss events that could bring those to fruition. And we do that by mapping against frameworks such as MITRE ATT&CK, carrying out specific assessments, vulnerability assessments, or more effectively simulations to be able to validate controls and where vulnerabilities are. As well as making sure that's very threat driven, using a variety of sources. And then the third area is really using this information to identify where those gaps are and validate those remediations that you're putting in place, and then creating what we've referred to as use case kits, which ultimately are designed to reduce those risks. They're there to operationalize detection and response capabilities, to continuously stay ahead of the changing threat landscape. Bruce, do you want to go into this in a bit more detail?
Yes, but I think before we do that, there's something not shown here, but it's worth noting that before we can create the gap analysis and do the continuous improvement, we generally start by doing capabilities baselining. Mm-hmm. And in capabilities baselining, I look for the use cases that a customer may already have. I identify whether or not they're prevention or detection based. We map the preventions to the MITRE framework. Same thing for the detection capabilities, but we need to identify whether there's a detection capability or a detection and response capability and how effective that response is. And then we can start the process, now that we have this capability baseline, of identifying a desired state. And the way we start there is taking the risk register, the business risk register, we extract the cyber risks, and then we map that to this list of negative outcomes. And fortunately, when we did a fair bit of research on this, we found there are only 16 negative outcomes. In other words, essentially, one of the ways to look at it is something bad that could happen to the business, and defines a general way that bad thing would happen. There's only 16 of them. So we map those negative outcomes to the cyber risks extracted from the risk register. And then we go through the process of identifying all of the potential scenarios that would bring that negative outcome to fruition. Fortunately, once again, that's a limited number. At most, there were 8 different scenarios that could facilitate one of these negative outcomes. And then we can map that scenario to call it a realization scenario list. And then we can map that again to the MITRE tactics and come up with a desired state. If you go to the next slide, we'll start working through a little bit more on that. But first, we need to identify for each of those negative outcomes where we've identified a scenario. The fact is, for every scenario, there's what I refer to as an impact curve. And this impact curve identifies a cyber loss occurrence and the maximum amount of loss over time if nothing was done. So the maximum impact on this curve that you see in front of you is the potential loss for that attack if no mitigation is applied. And this particular example is for a self-replicating variant of ransomware that does encryption or destruction of data. And if you had an environment with 250 systems, obviously at second 1, when the first infection happens, you have 1 system infected, and it's a rather parabolic curve up. In other attack scenarios, we may find that the curve is relatively flat and hockey sticks up, and yet other attacks, it may be an inverse parabolic curve. But for every attack scenario, there's a different impact curve. So the next thing we want to do is look at the placement on that curve that represents an acceptable loss to the company. And that window, that's the response window. If we can have our actual response within that response window, then we can predict the loss and actually start to measure the risk for each one of these scenarios. And that's the purpose of the impact curve and defining that. So as part of that process that I was talking about earlier of mapping the negative outcomes to scenarios, some things we want to do, and these are just examples, this isn't actual data, but we could look at a particular negative outcome, such as data disclosure, damage driven. We would look at the systems involved, the locations, the purpose of those systems, the CIA impact of those, and then start coming up with a list of scenarios. We might say scenario number 1 is compromised system of privileged or non-privileged user for data collection exfil. And then the next step is to identify the potential actors for that type of scenario so that we get a clue as to the types of tactics and techniques. So let's say we identify several threat actors that typically perpetrate that type of attack. And then we can look at the attack techniques and tactics and the tactics that are required for success. In this case, we would say initial access, that has to happen. Execution has to happen. They have to do discovery, collection of the data, command and control, and exfiltration. So we know essentially the kill chain for this particular scenario. And then we could start listing out all of the techniques. And this is where the use cases come in. Use cases actually map to specific techniques, and they may map to subvariants of those techniques or detection mechanisms within those techniques based on the data sources that are available in the environment. We'll also look at the potential vulnerabilities that would allow those techniques to be used and cross out the ones that exploit vulnerabilities that don't exist in that environment. Look at the predicted evidence, so we know what types of data we're looking for. Define the acceptable loss based on that previous slide and the impact curve. And from that, we should be able to derive what our response requirements are. In other words, how fast do we need to be able to respond, and calculate out a response playbook that allows us to be well within that response window. Once we've done all of that work, we now can derive the desired state. And that's the place where the organization needs to be in order to mitigate that particular scenario, and map that again to the capabilities matrix that we developed earlier in the capabilities baselining. And from there, we can create our gap analysis to say, here are the use cases that need to be developed in order to bring you to that desired state. In the next slide, we have an example of the process we go through. So there are a number of different inputs into the factory. And that middle box there is really the core of the use case factory. It's developing the detection rules, develop the response playbooks, identify any integrations and enrichment sources. And by integration and enrichment sources, what I mean is if I were to see an attack, potential attack happening, and I can get one of the observable elements of that attack is an IP address, an external IP address, something I might want to do is go contact a threat intelligence system and find out more information about that, find out their reputation, and see if the attack that I think might be happening is indicative of the reputation of that IP address. So it helps me with the triage so that I can respond faster. Similarly, automation of security controls and orchestration of security controls within the environment to speed the response. All of this, again, intended to ensure that my actual response is within that response window. And the input into the factory is one of four things. Customer-driven assessments, these workshops to identify the gap analysis, MITRE mapping, so just a general coverage map, and also threat intelligence. And this is really key as we do continuous investigation for new attacks, new techniques that are being developed, and also chatter about that organization and what might be launched against them. We can develop use cases quickly to facilitate the detection of those new attacks. And then also SOC monitoring. And when I say SOC monitoring, what I mean by that is the SOC may say, I deal with this attack 10 times a day, and here's the steps I take. And I could automate those steps, save myself time, and give myself more time to work on the more important tasks. So developing a mechanism for the SOC to have an input into the use case factory to develop automations is also critical. Then we test and implement that and operationalize it. Again, operate very much like a factory.
Thanks. And yeah, you would have heard, obviously, the term we use, factory, and we want to introduce that to you a little bit. Obviously, when you look at the previous slide, this is an example of the final step of that continuous improvement process in terms of having the ability to be able to have triggers, whether that's an assessment or whether that's threat intel input or monitoring your SOC or mapping against MITRE ATT&CK, having that input and then having the ability, and Bruce used the term factory, to be able to then develop those use case kits consisting of all those different components, and then making sure you test, integrate, and operationalize it. And this is exactly what we've seen as a real need from customers, and we wanted to share this kind of approach with you. We recognize that the development of use case kits that leverage automation requires resources and skills that are not easy to come by. The process of creating customized use case kits is something which demands kind of that hands-on cybersecurity experience, as well as the know-how to not just automate, but also be able to integrate with other technologies, being able to have that agility and repository of all that information and data, and be able to also have access to those different components, such as the automations, the integrations, the enrichments, the custom scripting, the dashboarding, reporting, everything which ideally a SOC wants to focus on. Now, this process obviously is something which is needed to be able to stay ahead of attacks, but that's the problem. It's the fact that this is taking too long to do. That it means that we're not being able to stay ahead of that changing threat landscape. So we need to find a way of staying ahead and defining and measuring performance by what we call using a use case factory. And it's really that mechanism to be able to reduce risk across the business. And what I mean by that is a top-down approach in terms of communicating with executive management and justifying investments in security investments, and a bottom-up approach as well in terms of driving operational efficiency and focusing on detection and response efforts. So this is the use case factory model that we're applying. And as you can see, the goal really is to measurably reduce risks in line with the customer's target response window of acceptable loss, something which Bruce mentioned earlier. This is packaged as a use case kit consisting of detection rules, response playbooks, integrations, and automations that drives down the impact of an attack, and has to be aligned with the customer's threat profile and risk profile, as well as their IT landscape. There needs to be an understanding of that as well. So we will typically deploy this as part of or deploy baseline use case kits as part of service onboarding. We map that against the MITRE ATT&CK framework in order to be able to continuously baseline threat detection coverage, and then this helps us to be able to define an acceptable target response window and effective procedures and what to automate by leveraging things like digital playbooks and integrations. And as you can see at the top right-hand corner there, you've got a glimpse into that supply chain, which is really the stages of the factory. And we call it factory really because it does require groups of teams to be able to work in a factory-like environment, but a digital lab, I guess is the right way of putting it, to be able to build these modular components. And I'll just pass on to Bruce to go in a bit more detail about this.
Right. So the idea was to truly build a factory model, to have a supply chain and a modular component build via specialized assembly lines, and then have those multiple assembly lines synchronized so that the finished product arrived at the end of each one of them at the same time for quality assurance, integration, and deployment. And we also implemented a Six Sigma Light model for efficiency and defect-free production. Again, the goal is to do rapid deployment of the use cases and make sure that we have all of the stakeholders able to request use cases. Another really important idea within the use case factory is the modular component library. And you'll notice here there are three different work tracks, and each one of those work tracks maintains their own library of components. So there could be a master use case, and then there are use cases for specific customers. But within that, there's a detection rule modular library focused on various SIMs. So when a new use case requirement comes in, if that particular SIM and data source and detection rule is already available, it can be assembled into that quickly. And then the same thing is true for the playbook. There's a modular library that has a master playbook, and then it can be customized for the specific environment. And the same thing for the integration and automation. We map that to a system type, a system name, and then a usage. For example, if I got a request to build a augment to a use case that says, I've seen this type of malware detected in this particular part of the environment through an IDS system, what next? Well, the next thing might be to check the vulnerability management environment and query that to see if any of the systems throughout the network were vulnerable to that particular exploit. We might also query the threat intelligence environment to map that exploit to a threat actor group and other malware that they typically use. And so all of these integrations might be built in a modular system library. For example, for that vulnerability management, I can have a vulnerability management system type. Underneath that, I might have a system name of Qualys or Rapid7, and then underneath that, various usage components like query for vulnerability or run vulnerability scan. So again, we built it much like a factory model with modular components and separate assembly lines so that they can operate independently and then construct the use case kit at the end of the assembly line. And here's an example of that merging of the capabilities matrix, the desired state, and creating the gap analysis all in one slide. Essentially, this was done by the threat intelligence team. We looked at the Maze ransomware. We took the deployed rules within the customer environment, the techniques that were covered by their SIM in blue. We identified the Maze techniques, specific Maze techniques that were covered by their SIM and highlighted those in green. And then we looked at the areas where there were Maze techniques that were not covered by the SIM rules and highlighted those in red. So this created our heat map for us. And you'll notice the interesting thing I pointed out earlier is that in some of those tactic columns, there's multiple red blocks. And that's one of the advantages that attackers have is they can mix and match those. They don't have to get all three of those in one of those columns. If they get one of them working, then they can accomplish that tactic. So that's why we have to look at each one of them and create a use case or detection rule and response to each one of them and be able to start assembling those detection rules into a cohesive pattern so we can identify that, yes, Maze ransomware is the attack that we're under.
Thanks, Bruce. We've actually just got a question in, and I'll let you answer this, Bruce. So one person has asked, how are SOCs now changing? Is that right? Yeah, changing. How are SOCs now changing as part of this? All the SOC environments change as part of this new environment that they're in terms of remote working. So I think that they're trying to ask here exactly how should the SOC be working now that everyone's working remotely. We've got analysts who are having to work remotely. What's the optimum way for them to be detecting and responding to threats from home if they themselves are away from some of their key assets?
Again, it starts with the process and the methodology. The SOC should be thought of as the response team and potentially the detection and analysis team, but you really need to have a upfront workshop team and built into the use case factory. And the use case factory served multiple purposes. They defined the supply chain. And when I say define the supply chain, what I mean is look at the risks, look at the various scenarios that could happen based on the fact that people are now working from home, identify the potential risks, and from there analyze the highest probability risks, prioritize those, and then look at the detection mechanisms for identifying the attack scenarios that are part of that risk model and developing the implementation strategy for it. So the SOC again becomes a user of the use case factory within the company, but not and driving it from an efficiency standpoint, but not trying to do it themselves. I do recommend that there's a need for you could consider it a bolt-on organization to the SOC, but an addition to the SOC of a use case team. And one of the things we developed was a library of these use cases. I was talking earlier about having modular components and a modular use case library. So we developed a set of master use cases, and then underneath that master use case, there's various SIM detections, integrations, playbooks. But the bottom line is the master use case contains all of the components necessary to implement that use case. And we built those into a library where you can shop for them based on tactic, technique, or feature. So I could say, here are the 10 techniques that I need to be able to respond to for this attack scenario that's critical to my business. I could then go into the library and shop for based on those 10 techniques and find the use cases that would facilitate detection and response to those attacks. I could do that based again on tactic, technique, or by feature. And by feature, I mean a particular risk or threat, or also whether or not it's fully automated, the degree of automation, the number of automations in it, and so forth.
Yeah, and I guess this is exactly the sort of certainly with our customers, certainly the sort of user experience that they're looking for, and potentially another way of looking at how to deploy the right detection and response capabilities to be able to prevent an attack from happening in the first, or at least preventing the impact to surpass that acceptable level. So just the ability to be able to kind of browse based on your stage of that journey as well. If you're aware of the risks that you're facing, to be able to go into a catalog such as this, and that's what we see a lot with customers going in and saying, okay, yeah, these are definitely the risks that I'm facing. Therefore, what are the right scenarios that I should be provided, or I should be enhancing my detection and response capabilities for to mitigate, or even to more depth if they've already understood some of those enrichments or rules that they need. They can go into more depth and even go into the MITRE ATT&CK framework and say these are the areas where I'm missing and have that heat map capability. We do actually just have another question from someone called Danny Tanus. What's the difference with use cases between the three categories: deployed rules, covered, and not covered?
So what I meant there is we can say that we have a use case that wasn't developed yet. So in other words, the three categories are deployed. I deployed this use case, but it doesn't apply to this particular scenario. I covered it, so it applies to this scenario, and I have that use case deployed. And the last category of not covered means I haven't deployed that use case yet, so I have a blind spot.
Yeah.
The other thing to keep in mind is that if anybody, for any of you that have actually looked at the MITRE framework and read through the techniques, there's a lot in there that says this is really hard to prevent, or it's impossible to prevent in all cases. But at the end of the day, if you can't detect it, then you really do have a blind spot. And if you can detect a technique and then automate your response to happen in near real time, well, I would say that's almost as good as prevention. As long as that response is within your acceptable loss window, or your acceptable loss window, you can actually go back to senior management and say, for this negative outcome and all the scenarios that we've mapped to this negative outcome, again, maps to their risk in their risk register, you can actually trace back through, for this risk in the risk register, here's how it hits the negative outcome map, here's all the scenarios, here's the viable scenarios, here's how we've covered them, here's how we're going to respond to them, and we can show that each one of these has a response that's within the acceptable loss response window, and we have thus demonstrated quantifiably that we've reduced risk for the organization. And that's kind of a new concept.
Yeah, and that's certainly something which we're I guess differentiating from is having this kind of this mechanism which allows you to be able to have that level of conversation, not only bottom up from the operation team or from the architects up to the board, but also top down, identifying those key negative outcomes and putting in a request for a use case that helps you to mitigate that particular negative outcome. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. I think this is something we get asked as well, especially on the onboarding stage of the customer journey, is okay, well, how does this work in terms of deploying the use case factory as part of the services architecture? So as you can see right at the bottom, and by the way, this is a typical services architecture that we would build to enable a much smarter SOC, much more modernized SOC for a customer. We'd start with that first layer in terms of identifying the applications, the data points, the devices, the users that we're looking to monitor and collect audit logs from, sys logs, security logs, all of this data, and really making sure that we cover everything, exactly where the data resides, across network users, endpoints, cloud, private cloud, infrastructure service, SaaS, for that better context. And then having a security data lake, something we're doing with a lot of our customers, is then having that data lake to be able to consume all of that information. Then we use something which we call the CyberProof log collection platform as well, which is actually able to parse this data. So particularly for large organizations who are operating cross-geo, having multiple compliance regulations they need to comply with, and they need to be able to map a lot of this data so that it's structured in a way which it can then be effectively analyzed by the SIM. And as you can see there, the way that we operate, we're very SIM agnostic. We leverage existing SIMs we can deploy a SIM platform to be able to find that needle in the haystack, and that's part of that kind of second layer. Typically with larger organizations, we'll see a need to deploy a cloud native SIM such as Azure Sentinel. And then on top of that, third layer is really where the CyberProof Defense Center comes in, and that's our service delivery platform, which enables the automation, the orchestration of all of that information. And as you can see, that little picture of CMO there, that's our virtual analyst bot, enables teams to be able to collaborate with the bot, with artificial intelligence, to say, okay, I want to automate alert triage, I want to automate incident enrichment, and I want to be able to automate a specific response. So that can all be put into a playbook, which is then continuously updated by use case factory. So as you can see, you've got the use case factory on the right there, which is really there to continuously improve detection and response. And that's something which operates from our end. As Bruce alluded to, we can just baseline exactly the use cases that are needed, or for real continuous improvement, we can have a model where we have this as completely integrated into the services architecture, and it's continuously pumping in the detection rules and optimizing your capabilities for you. And as you can see on the left, you've got all of those enrichment sources where we may be collecting vulnerability data, threat intel data, etc. And then at the top, you can see that collaborative remediation in terms of where we all work as an extension of the customer's team to collaboratively respond to incidents and manage incidents. So that's all we've got time for this session. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Just to summarize everything we've gone through, start by re-asking those right questions. What business risks do you most want to avoid, and what assets are involved? Remember that detection and response is really something which is influencing strategic goals right now. In order to do that, you need to be able to put in place an agile process to identify those attack scenarios that would cause those risks to happen, and then be able to identify and map exactly what the capabilities are that you're missing. Ensure that you put in place or identify a response window for acceptable loss that will enable you to communicate exactly the value that your detection response processes are contributing, and either work with an outsourced provider like CyberProof, or build a capability to continuously pump in those use case kits to continuously stay ahead of the threat landscape. And I think that's all we've got time for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. The next session will be with Lior, and I believe we've posted the link in the chat. So please join that session where he'll take you through some quite amazing tricks in terms of being able to read minds over Zoom. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and we speak to you soon.